It's week 2 of the trial against Alec Murdaugh, and more people packed into the courthouse showing up to hear arguments from the state and defense. Murdaugh is charged in the murder of his wife Maggie and younger son Paul. They were found shot to death in June of 2021. Today, the defense was able to cross-examine a senior agent with the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division about her assessment of that crime scene.
And Tori, that's right. The defense used this testimony as their opportunity to question how one person could have killed both Maggie and Paul while using separate guns. Investigators believe Maggie was killed with a rifle while Paul was killed using a shotgun. Now you can see this diagram here behind me. This was presented in court today. It shows both the bodies of Maggie and Paul here to my far left, and all these yellow markers you see here are evidence in regards to some of the ammunition, either bullet strikes or some of the casings there from the gun. Also the different trajectory there by some of those guns and those bullets. Well, the senior agent, Melanie Worley, was the first person on the stand today, and the defense questioned her extensively about the trajectory of different bullets and asked how investigators processed the scene. But the defense says one explanation is there was more than one gunman, and Worley said that's possible.
But doesn't this indicate to you there were two shooters? There was a shooter up here and a shooter down here. Is it a possibility? Let me say this. Is it a possibility that there are two shooters, based on the data you collected?
It just indicated there was movement between.
Movement from here all the way up to here?
I don't know that it went all the way up there.
But is it, I'm not telling you, I mean, one explanation would be movement, correct? One explanation would be two shooters. I'm sorry? Yes?
I wasn't there.
No. But one explanation of this data would be two shooters. One explanation, not the, but one.
Not the only one.
Yeah, not the only one. But it is a reasonable explanation, just like one shooter running up that way, correct?
Sure.
Now, the prosecution pushed back against this theory when they questioned Worley, who testified it was also possible one person could have committed both murders using different guns.
And the defense asked you about some different possibilities here. It's possible that people can move around.
Yes.
And it's also possible that one person could have had two guns.
That's right.
Now, we heard from another witness with SLED who said they found ammunition in a shotgun on the Murdaugh property that matched the two different casings found around Paul's body. There's been speculation before the trial that the defense would bring up the theory of two shooters. And so we now want to bring in Fox County's Grace Runkle, who is inside the courtroom today. And Grace, you spoke with a former law enforcement officer turned professor about the challenge the state faces to prove Alec Murdaugh acted alone.
Well, that's right. After a career in law enforcement, Brian Cranny has gone on to become the head of the criminal justice department at Greenville Technical College. We spoke with him before the trial, and he told me that at the end of this, all that matters is what the jury thinks. And he says the one shooter theory, the idea that one person used two guns, is hard to swallow. Both Maggie and Paul were killed with long barrel shotguns. And Cranny says the idea that Murdaugh fired one weapon, put that down, then picked up and fired another may not seem very likely to some people. He says the fact that there were two guns used to kill Maggie and Paul complicates things.
It adds a lot of alternative theories. And even if the primary theory of the prosecution, if it meets all the elements of the crime, if the jury is left with unanswered questions, they can interpret that as reasonable doubt and find him not guilty based on that.
And speaking of alternative theories, the defense so far has attempted to poke as many holes as possible in the state's case, from handling the crime scene to how evidence was processed, even how interviews were conducted. So this will likely not be the last time we hear about the two-shooter theory, Justin.
And Grace, as far as the jury's reaction, it seemed like they were going over a lot today. They were bringing up multiple guns that they were seized there on the Murdaugh property. It seems like a lot of this was monotonous today. Did it seem like the jury was still as interested as what they have appeared to be after the first week?
You know, even though these are long days going over a lot of small details, the jury has seemed pretty engaged whenever a diagram is brought up or any more video evidence is presented. You see them lean forward in their seats, trying to get as good a look as possible. And at times they even requested that items be moved so that they could see the screens in front of them even more clearly. So they are definitely invested in getting as much out of this as they possibly can. Live in Walterboro, Grace Runkle, Fox Carolina News.
All right, Grace, thank you. We've been covering the Murdaugh murder charges since the very beginning. We'll continue to do so right here on Fox Carolina News. Make sure you stay with us for complete coverage. You can also find it on air, online, as well as stream us on Roku, Apple, and Fire TV.